Okay. 1 second. And welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. Tonight we are finishing our series, The Spiritual Geography of the Land of Israel. I'm going to hope to get a whole lot in tonight. I want to start where we left off last week. We dedicated the whole class last week to the spiritual geography of Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, to Jerusalem. And I just want to add a few points. And the rest of the evening, I'm going to try to get in really as much as I can from many, many different aspects. So when we learned about the four holy cities, we made a connection with the four elements. Svat is air, and we discussed this at length. Svat is air, Tiberias is water, and Hebron is earth. These are all very, very obvious. And I realized that I didn't make the connection strong enough that Yerushalayim is connected to fire. Why is Yerushalayim connected to fire? The two main reasons is that, as we learned, not only is Israel the middle of the world, but the middle of Israel is Yerushalayim. The middle of Yerushalayim is the Temple Mount. The middle of the Temple Mount is the temple, and the middle of the temple is the Holy of Holies. But in the temple, there are two aspects of fire and light. One is what we'll call a more inner fire, and the outer is a more outside. So the inner fire is, of course, of the menorah, the 7 branched candelabra. And here the lights were lit every day. And now is not the time to go into the tremendous symbolism of the menorah. But this was a fire, flames that were lit every single day with all of their significance of God's light and Israel's light. And it's called the light from above, or Yeshar, or Choser, the returning light. But in the midst of the sanctuary, there is fire, there's light. There's also, I just added it. There's also the incense was lit every single day, taken from a fire from the altar, and the incense was lit. So that's on the inner dimension of fire of Yerushalayim. The outer is the altar where all of the offerings were brought. And on the altar, there were actually 3 different fires burning continually for quite literally hundreds and hundreds of years. One of the miracles that we're told that occurred in the temple is rain. It was out in the open. Rain never put out the fires, no matter how torrential they were. The fires just kept on burning. And so the fire of the offerings have been replaced by our prayers. And just like the offerings needed to be consumed on the altar, our prayers need to be full of fire, enthusiasm, excitement, an aroused soul. So this is the aspect of fire that is connected to Yerushalayim. Now, there's another aspect which is even precedes the temple, and we've been discussing the names of different places, not just cities, but valleys and mountains, rivers, and all of the names have tremendous significance. I'm just letting people in here. And so we need to discuss the name of Yerushalayim. So we know that in the chronological order, the first introduction to Yerushalayim, it's called Shalem. That is when Avram comes back from the war of the 4 kings versus the 5 kings. He brings back the captives, including his nephew Lot, and he goes to the place called Shalem. And Malki Tzedek comes out and greets him, and he's called the priest of the lofty God, Elyon. And there it's called Shalem. And it's understood that Malki Tzedek is Shem, the son of Noach. And that's what the city was called, Shalem. Then when Avram was commanded to bring Yitzchak up as an offering, what's called Akedah Yitzchak, the end of Parshat Vayera. So after Avram appears to be ready to do this, it's a much, much deeper story than we can go into right now. But an angel comes and tells him, don't touch him. Now God knows that you have fear of God. And so the word for fear is yireh. But the word yireh, the same letters also means to see or to be seen. And so in Parshat Vayera, in chapter 19, verse 14. So it says, after this whole incident, so it says, Vayikra Avram Shem HaMakom Ahu, and according to tradition, this is happening on the Temple Mount. That's the significance. Akedah Yitzchak is happening on the Temple Mount. And it says, Vayikra Avram Shem HaMakom Ahu Hashem Yireh, that Avram called the name of this place Hashem sees. Hashem sees. But again, there's a deep play on words here. What is God seeing? He's seeing Avram's fear of God, his awe of God. But then he continues, and it says, he calls the name of the place Hashem Yireh, Asher Ye'amar Hayom Bahar Hashem Yira'eh. And the verse continues and says that it is said on this day, in the mountain, God will be seen. So here, it's such a deep, we'll use the expression play on words. Of course, it's much deeper than that. So first he calls it that God sees, and then he says, because it is said on this day that God will be seen. So in other words, Avram is very aware of God's presence. God is being seen by Avraham. And yet at the same time, God is seeing what Avram is doing and what Yitzchak is doing. This is one of the most archetypal stories in the entire Tanakh, almost bar none. This story has deep implications to this day. And it has had a tremendous influence and effect on not just Judaism, but on Christianity and Islam as well. Anyone can look in my book, One Was Avram, where there's a deep analysis of this incident. So now we have two different names of what we call Yerushalayim. It was called Shalem, and now Avram's calling it Yireh or Yera'eh. And so the Midrash says that since God had great respect, not only for Avram, but also for Melchizedek and Shem. And so God puts the two names together. Yireh Shalem Yerushalayim. And what's interesting is, I forgot the exact number. Don't quote me, but I think the name Yerushalayim is mentioned something like 900 times in the Tanakh. And interestingly enough, except I think for 3 times, it is not spelled with a yud. We spell it Yerushalayim with the yud and the mem at the end. In almost every single case, it's called Yerushalem, not Yerushalayim. We call it Yerushalayim with the yud, but almost all the time, because that's almost the literal combination of these two words, the Yireh, Yeru, Shalem. So I thought that was important to point out the connection to fire and the name of Yerushalayim. One last thing I'd like to bring is in the 125th Psalm. It's one of the Shir HaMalot. There is a very, very important verse about Yerushalayim. Actually, a number of the songs of ascent from David mention Yerushalayim. But here, I just wanted to, because it here has a connection to the geography. And so in the second verse, so I'll just read it from the beginning. Shir HaMalot, Habotchim ba'Hashem kehar Tzion lo yemut leolam yeshev. This is called the Song of Ascents, that they who trust in God will be like Har Tzion, which cannot be removed. Har Tzion is established. And so those who trust in God, again, this is Zion, Zionism, comes from one of the mountains of Yerushalayim. Last week, we talked at length about how Yerushalayim is made up of a series of mountains, and each one has its own name because of their importance. Har HaZeitim, Har HaBayit, Har HaTzofim. But we didn't talk about Har Tzion. So this is one of the mountains that make up Yerushalayim. And of course, it has tremendous significance because the whole movement called Zionism comes from Har Tzion. Now, I'll just mention that when I first came to Israel, that is where I went to yeshiva, quite literally on Har Tzion, the Esper Yeshiva, literally on Har Tzion. So that's how this psalm begins. And then it says, Yerushalayim, again, here, it's without a yud. And so it's really pronounced Yerushalayim, Harim Savivla. Yerushalayim, mountains surround it. Hashem Saviv Amo Me'ata V'Adolam. And Hashem surrounds his people from now until forever. This is a very well-known verse that's connecting the spiritual geography. In other words, just like Jerusalem has mountains all around it, it's defined by the topography of these mountains. That is what makes Jerusalem so special. But here it's saying that that topographical element is a symbol of how God surrounds his people from now and forever. So it's just a very, very beautiful, beautiful connection to the spiritual geography of the land of Israel, and here, especially Jerusalem. Okay, so now we're talking about names. So we haven't discussed that when Avram first comes to the land, it's not called Eretz Yisrael. It's called Eretz Canaan. And that name is repeated many, many, many times in the book of Genesis, because it hasn't taken on the name Eretz Yisrael yet. So let's just understand what Canaan means. Canaan comes from Hachna'ah, which means submission, or depending on the degree, subjugation. So here we can understand that this name has two almost opposite meanings in relationship to the people of Israel. So Canaan, again, means submission. For those who are frequent visitors to these classes, know that we have discussed the three-pronged process as described by the Baal Shem Tov: Hachna'ah, Havdalah, and Hamtakah. That every process goes through three stages of submission, separation, and sweetening. We submit ourselves to a task. We separate those things that are extraneous to the task so that we will be able to do it. And then the sweetening is a job well done and our ability to express thanks to God. But the submission part has a lot to do with submitting the ego and not letting it overcome everything. So there's something about Eretz Canaan that the Jewish people had to submit to God's will in order to be able to subjugate the land. Because in theory, God could have sent us to a land that was empty. But he sent us to a land that needed to be subjugated. So see, it's like two different ideas: the idea of submitting one's ego, one's will to God, and at the same time that God purposely makes it that we need to subjugate the land of Israel to make it Eretz Yisrael. That's why later in the book of Devarim, God says to, here in the literal sense, it means the people. He says that you're ma'at mikol ha'amim. You're the fewest of all of the people. And of course, if you look at the world's population, until this day, the Jewish people have always been a minuscule percentage of the world population. But it's apparent that that's how God wanted it. In other words, that such a small people are destined to make such a big effect, influence in the world. But that's also the secret of Eretz Yisrael. It's the smallest of all the countries. It's minuscule. On the map of the world, it is absolutely minuscule. This is something that we've discussed many times. So now let's go to the name Eretz Yisrael. It's, of course, named after Yaakov, who receives the name Yisrael when he fights with the angel, he fights with Esav, he fights with God, he fights with himself. Also, one of the archetypal stories in the entire Torah, how Yaakov gets the name Yisrael. But the Torah actually gives a definition. Ki sarita im Elokim v'anashim v'tuchal. Because you contended with God and with man, and you prevailed. That is what Yisrael means. That is the name Yisrael. And so we could say quite literally, to this day, this is the reality of Eretz Yisrael. We are still fighting with ourselves, with God, with Esav, with Yishmael, with everything to maintain our ability to stay in Eretz Yisrael. So it's very important to understand that the name Eretz Yisrael, it's based on that archetypal battle that Yaakov fought in order to merit the name Yisrael. But that name is called on the land as well. But here we have an interesting thing because, of course, the son of Yaakov is Yitzchak. And so there's a beautiful understanding that if you take the 4 letters of Yitzchak, each one of them represents a different name that we refer to the land of Israel by. And the reason is, of the 3 patriarchs, he is the only one who did not leave Israel. And God commanded him not to leave Israel. Even when there was a famine, Avram left, he went to Egypt. But when there was a famine, God came to him and said, do not leave Eretz Yisrael. In other words, there's something about the soul of Yitzchak that was completely connected to the land of Israel. So the name Yitzchak has 4 letters, Yud, Sadi, Chet, Kuf. So the Yud is, we refer to the land as Eretz Yisrael. Yisrael begins with a Yud. That's the first of the 4 letters, Eretz Yisrael. The second one, and we've discussed this many times, Eretz Yisrael is referred to Eretz Tzvi, the land of the deer. And we gave a number of reasons for that. One is that the deer, the skin of a deer is very, very taut. And it's said that if you skin a deer, there would be no way you could ever put the skin back on the deer because it was so tight. Once it's taken off, there's no way to get it back on. And so this, again, is indicative of in a certain way, the concentrated geographical reality of Israel. It's taut. It's like tight in a small place. The other reason is Tzvi is Gematria Emunah, 102. Emunah means faith. So it's called the land of faith. And again, to this day, we are living it every single day. The fact that we are being bombed every single day, actually for the last 2.5 years, and the last 76 years, 77 years, almost 78 years. We are being bombed continually, and yet Israel continues to grow and survive and thrive because the people have a deep faith that this is our land and we are meant to be here. And the last one is more of a Kabbalistic, is that in the alphabet called Atbash, when you exchange the first letter for the last letter, the second letter for the second last letter, the name Tzvi comes out to be Moshe. The Tzadi becomes the Hey, the Beit. Wait 1 second, 1 second. Oh, yes, the Beit is the Shin, and the Yud, excuse me, the Tzadi is the Hey, the Bet is the Shin, and the Yud is the Mem of Moshe. The third letter is the Chet, and many times Eretz Yisrael is called Eretz Chaim, a very, very well-known cemetery outside of Beit Shemesh is called Eretz Chaim, the land of life, which maybe sounds paradoxical to name a cemetery, but since we believe in the soul having eternal life, so Eretz Yisrael, remember in Elo, we say, Luli Amanti Lirot Betuv Hashem Be'eretz Chaim. David HaMelech says, if I would not believe that Luli Amanti, that I would see the goodness of God in the land of the living. So that's the Chet, and the Kuf is Kodesh. We call the land the Holy Land. Eretz HaKodesh. So this is a very beautiful thing that the 4 letters of Yitzchak spell out. The Yud is Yisrael, the Tzadi is Tzvi, the Chet is Chaim, and the Kuf is Kodesh. Like I said, I want to get through a lot tonight. So I'm going to be like on a speed track here. We have talked about rain in Eretz Yisrael. We talked very much about 2 of the lakes, Yam Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, and Yam HaMelech, the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea. But there actually are a few more lakes in Israel. So I just wanted to mention them. One is up on the Golan Heights, and I've been there. It's not a large lake, but it's a lake, and it's there around the calendar, and it's called Birkat Ram, and it's in the area where Druzim live, and it's surrounded by apple orchards. And I've actually gone there twice. The apple orchards are absolutely beautiful. People are very nice. And we went to the lake, and one time we actually walked around it. It's not a huge lake. And then there's another lake that has tremendous significance geographically. And that is when the settlers first came to Israel they're not the first ones. There were always Jews here. There was always a presence. And in fact, in the late 1700s, there was a quite large aliyah of Hasidic Jews, and then Jews that followed the Vilna Gaon. But in the 1880s, many secular settlers first started coming. And when they came up north, between a little bit south of what we call Kiryat Shmona, there was the Chula Valley. And the Chula Valley was a swamp, and it literally had malaria there. And the settlers, at great risk to their lives, drained the swamps. Many people got malaria. And to this day, it's now a very, very fertile area. But there was actually problems because it was a swamp for who knows how long, for a long time. And so environmentally, it had problems, even though it became very fertile. And so they reintroduced some of the swampland, and there are now two lakes in the Chula Valley. And they have tremendous significance worldwide because every spring, like actually right now, and every fall, there is a migration of birds between Africa and Europe. And Israel is actually one of the greatest tracks of migration of birds in the entire world. And one of the places where they stop to rest is these two lakes in the Chula Valley. And when I talk about migration, and I'm not exaggerating, we're talking about millions of birds every spring, every fall. In fact, the other day here, we were able to see one of the flocks coming up from, they're actually coming up from Africa to Europe, because in the summer, it's burning hot in a lot of Africa, and it's cooler in Europe. In the fall, they come the opposite direction. They come from Europe back to Africa. And I've had the great fortune on a number of occasions to be by these lakes during the migration. And it is an experience of a lifetime. We're talking about, over a month, millions of birds pass over Israel, and most of them will stop for a few hours, a few days, a few weeks to recoup themselves in the Chula Valley. And what happened is that they were eating up the food of all of the farmers. And so by these lakes, they started feeding the birds. And now the birds have figured it out. They don't need to take from all of the farms. They just need to come to these lakes, and they have all the food they could have for free. So that's just a very, very important idea, these extra little lakes. And environmentally and geographically, these lakes in the Chula Valley have tremendous significance. Israel is really one of the greatest bird watching places on the globe because of this. Okay, now since we're talking about lakes, let's talk a little bit more about waterfalls. So the strongest waterfall we've mentioned already, it's called Banyas. And in Hebrew, it's called the Hermon Falls. People come from all over the world to see this waterfall. In American terms, it's miniature. It's absolutely miniature. But it's something that I mentioned before, that the difference is that these falls are mine. They're ours. They're our falls. And so you could have Niagara Falls compared to the Banyas. I'll take the Banyas anytime because it's mine. So along with the Banyas, there is also another one that we've gone to scores of times, but it only runs in the winter. As all the snow is melting on the Hermon, at the bottom of the Golan Heights, there's a falls called Sa'ar Falls. And it's very powerful, but it only runs in the winter. It dries up in the summer. The tallest waterfall in Israel, it's not as powerful as the Banyas. That is in a place called Gamla. up on the Golan Heights. Gamla is one of the places where, oh, my wife.
I want to tell the story.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, this was 50 years ago. I sent this postcard to my parents. This is Nahal Sar in the Golan. And nowadays there's a bridge. There's a bridge that goes over the Nahal, over the river. But it didn't exist 50 years ago.
And it's only in the winter. So we've merited to see it many, many times. Yeah. Okay, so Gamla. Gamla it's the same word as Gamal, which means what's a Gamal in English? A camel, a camel. Why? Is because the mountain is like a hump. It looks like a camel's hump. There was a very famous Jewish city there, and it was taken over by the Romans and had a very similar story as Masada. There was a mass suicide in Gamla. But in Gamla is a waterfall. It's actually not a close walk to get to it. It's quite a far walk. We've done it. And by that waterfall, they're not really caves, but they're indentures in the rocks that eagles live. And so people go there with their binoculars because eagles are flying all around this waterfall. There's another waterfall in the Golan Heights called the Yehudia, also very well known. And it has a very famous place where you can jump from kind of like a cliff into this pool below. It's considered like a rite of passage to say that you have jumped into this pool at the Yehudia Falls. And there's another one in the Golan Heights called the Mapal HaLavan, the white waterfall. And I have to admit, I forgot to look up why it's called the white waterfall, but I've merited to be there also. Okay, moving on to caves. When we talked about Yerushalayim, we talked about caves. There are many famous caves in Yerushalayim, and I mentioned that it's certainly not the only place in the world that has a lot of caves, but Israel is known for a lot of caves because a lot of history happened in these different caves. And that's when we talked about Jerusalem, it wasn't just, oh, here's a cave, but the caves have names, and many of them have historical events. I live in the land of the Maccabees. And in the book of the Maccabees, so it talks about that this was, some people call it the first guerrilla war, because in those days, even in Israel, wars were fought like hundreds of movies that have been made. One army stands, 10,000 fold on one side, another army of 20,000 stand on the other side, and then and that's the war. And many people say that the first guerrilla war were the Maccabees against the Greeks. And it's known that they lived in the mountains and they lived in the caves. And so I remember when in the early days of the Moshav, we had an educational program here. So I used to take groups on tours of the area. And one of the things we did is I took them from cave to cave, small caves, not huge caves, but caves where the Maccabees quite literally hid out from the Greeks. Two other caves that I'll mention, and there are many, many, many more, is if you remember the story of Elijah the prophet, and when Achav and Izebel were killing all of the prophets. So one of the prophets who actually, unknown to Achav, was a prophet, and he was helping Eliyahu. He hid 50 prophets in two different caves. For those who were coming to our journey through the books of the prophets, so we learned about this. And he kept them fed for quite a while and saved them because the king and queen were quite literally killing all of the prophets. And so he hid 50 in one cave up north and another one more towards the south. And he and his wife took responsibility for keeping them alive. Another very, very famous cave, and many people probably have visited En Gedi. En Gedi is right next to the Dead Sea, but it's an oasis, and it's beautiful, beautiful place. It also has a waterfall. I didn't mention that. Almost all year round. It rarely will, only in like a 10-year drought. But there is a beautiful waterfall there. And people come from all over the world to hike in this oasis. And when you hike there, you see these caves in the cliffs surrounding. So one of the places that David HaMelech hid away from Shaul was in En Gedi, and it's written about. And one of the famous stories is Shaul was in a cave. It was in the evening. He had gone to sleep. His guards fell asleep. And David HaMelech sneaks into the cave, and he cuts off a piece of King Saul's robe. And he goes out, and then later he yells and he wakes everyone up. And first he castigates the guards. Why aren't you guarding your king? And he addresses Shaul, who has been trying to kill David. And he says to him, notice your robe is missing a piece. I could have killed you. But here I'm trying to prove to you, I mean you no harm. I'm not your enemy. And Shaul, who at that point was, we'll call him borderline schizophrenic, he cries, he asks David for forgiveness. I was wrong. I'll never bother you again. Unfortunately, the next day he's seeking to kill David again. So that's in one of the caves in En Gedi. And another famous story is that, again, David is hiding out. It could have been right at the same time. Now, this time, David is in a cave, and he goes to sleep. And we're told that beforehand, David had said, God, I understand everything that you've made, but I don't understand why you made crazy people and why you made spiders. And God answers, by your life, you will need both of these. And the crazy people is when David is trapped in the land of the Philistines, and they recognize him. He feigns insanity in order that they think, oh, this can't be David. This can't be the same person. He's a mad person. And it saves his life. And here in this cave, a spider comes and makes a web. So, so the soldiers of King Shaul are going and checking every place because they feel to know that he's here someplace. And they come to this cave and they see a spider web in front of the opening. And they say, well, he can't be in there because there's no way he could have gotten in past the spider web. And so they went on. And so a second time he was saved. I see my wife just put in a chat that our daughter, Hani, quite literally got married in a cave. It's a national park. It's called Beit Guvrin. Beit Guvrin has many caves. And outside of the national park, there is it's like a semicircle of a cave. And they fixed it up really beautifully. And that's where our daughter was married. And of course, I've mentioned, people who have been to my house know that right outside my front door is a cave. And if we're mentioning caves, maybe the most famous one is the one that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Elazar hid in for 12 years from the Romans. And according to tradition, that is where we'll call it the seed of the Zohar was written, compiled, realized, was in this cave in Pekin. By tradition, it's in Pekin. We've gone there. It's collapsed though. But there's a sign there that says this is the cave of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But interestingly enough, in the introduction of the Tikkunei Zohar, the very first thing it says is that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai escaped from the Romans to a cave in the Midbar, in the desert outside of Lud. Now, it just happens that we live right outside of Lud. And when we came to the Moshav, it was like a midbar. It was empty. There was nothing out here. We were like alone out here. And so quite literally, it could be that in one of the caves, maybe even by my front door, was the cave of Eliyahu Navi. Okay, going on. This will be a little bit longer class than usual because I want to get as much as I can in here. Okay, obviously I could spend a lot more time on this, but we've talked throughout the whole series that part of understanding the spiritual geography of the land of Israel is what grows here. And if you remember, I believe it was in the second class, we went to great length discussing the 7 special fruits of Israel: wheat, barley, grape, fig, pomegranate, olive, date. And it's connected not just because those are the food, but each food has to have a certain geography to be able to grow there properly. If it's a pure desert, you're not going to be able to grow any of these things. But I will mention something we've mentioned many times, is that the Gemara says the greatest sign of Mashiach coming is when the land turns green and fertile and productive again. Now remember, even to this day, 40% of Israel is desert, the Negev. But I've mentioned that you can go down to the Negev now, and a lot of it has been reclaimed. And there's certain places that are astounding how fertile they've become. Not even to mention the rest of Israel. As we mentioned, when Mark Twain came here in the 1880s and he wrote about it, he was startled by how barren the land was. He was shocked. Here, he was a devout Christian. He had read the Bible, and he expected to come to Israel and see this fertile, green, productive land. He was shocked. And he wrote about it. So and it's happening. Anyone can see it. The greatest sign of Mashiach coming is the land turning green. And so, along with talking about the fruits, we're going to mention just in short that the 3 pilgrimage holidays are all connected to agriculture. They all have a historic meaning. Pesach is when we came out of Egypt. Shavuos is when we received the Torah. Sukkot is actually connected more to Pesach. It doesn't have its own event, but it's the Sukkot, the booths that we lived in during the 40 years after we came out of Egypt. But each one of them has an agricultural component. Pesach, that's when we start to bring the Omer. We bring barley. And then we count 50 days till the wheat harvest. And the offering in the temple was 2 loaves of bread from the new wheat harvest. That was the important offering on Shavuos. And it was the only public offering that was chametz. All the other public offerings were not considered chametz. And so here, wheat harvest is connected to Shavuos, and Sukkot, even in the Torah, is called Chag HaAsif, the holiday of ingathering. When people, because Israel, there's no rain in the summer, so you harvest your wheat and your barley, and you let it dry in the field. You're not worried about rain. And you pick all of your fruits, and you dry your fruits. But the rains are going to start coming. And so it's called the holiday of the ingathering, when all of the fruits and the grains are brought into the barns, into threshing floors. So the holidays are very, very connected to the produce, and the produce is connected to what the land can give forth. Here we do have to mention, and we could easily have a whole class just on the idea of the sabbatical year, the Shemitah. Because, in short, this is when we give the land of Israel its rest. It's only in Eretz Yisrael. There is no Shemitah outside of Eretz Yisrael. This is definitely the prototype of the idea of letting your fields sit fallow in order to let them rest and not deplete all of their minerals and their strength. This was the biblical source of agriculture all over the world. It's understood that you have to give your fields a rest. Now they just pump it with chemicals, which is actually destroying the land. The produce will keep coming, but there's a certain place where the price has to be paid. But the Shemitah points out something much, much deeper than just allowing the land to sit fallow. And that is the question that is asked, because it's called a Shabbat for the land and a Shabbat for God. And so the question is asked, Rav Ginsburg has an entire book in Hebrew on Shemitah. And the first thing that is asked is, why does land need rest? Land is inanimate. What makes sense to give land rest? And the answer is because the land has a soul. And this becomes the basis for a whole book that I wrote, Life, Soul, and Consciousness Within All Creation. And there we show that whether it's mineral, vegetable, animal, or human, there is a level of God's life force. And so, but when we relate to the land, it's more than just life force. That's important in of itself, that nothing exists, including mountains and rocks and water, without God's life force animating it. But here we're talking that the land has a consciousness. And that's why in the book of Vayikra, in two different places, it talks about if you don't keep the mitzvot of the Torah and you turn away from God, the land will vomit you out. So the question is, it doesn't say God will throw you out of the land or God will make you go into exile. It says very specifically, the land will vomit you out because the land has a sensitivity and it cannot stand when the Jewish people do not keep the Torah. We say it in the Shema every single day. Second passage of the Shema. If you keep the mitzvot, you'll get the rain in its season and everything will be good. You'll have everything you need, total bounty. But if you don't listen to the words of the Torah, God will shut up the heavens and there will be no rain and you will not be able to stay on the land. But in this case, it literally says the land will vomit you out. So again, we would need a lot of discussion, but the whole idea of Shemitah is when we really, really become aware of the holiness of the land, because the produce becomes holy. Anyone who has lived in Israel during the Shemitah knows that you have to treat all of the produce that comes from the land differently than the other 6 years, because the produce has holiness to it. And that is because God has invested the earth with holiness, and we come to realize it, just like on Shabbat, there's holiness all 6 days of the week, but not to the extent that we feel it on Shabbat. That's why Shabbat is called Shabbos Kodesh. There's something holy about the seventh day that is qualitatively different than the 6 days. The same thing. The land of Israel is holy all the time. But we recognize it because we treat the land differently and we let it rest. And so this is obviously a big subject, but if we're talking about the spiritual geography of the land of Israel, how can we not mention the Shemitah year? This is one of the basics of understanding our connection to the land of Israel. Okay, now I want to mention just one thing in passing. And that is, remember, we talked about the four holy cities, and the land, and the city of Tzfat is connected to air. So here we're talking about the spiritual geography of the land of Israel. So there is a saying from the sages that Avira de Eretz Yisrael machkim. The air of Eretz Yisrael makes a person wise. So here, this is like a startling concept that even the air passing over, because air is not stagnant, it moves. But the air that is over the land of Israel makes you wise. In other words, the effect of the land rises to the air that's passing over. That the air of Eretz Yisrael makes you wise. We have to contemplate that one, but I wanted to mention it. Now, I'm saving two stories for the end, but this is very, very important. For those who were here in the beginning, I played a song from the words from the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. Now, again, I have to say, because we're about to take the Pesach break, I wanted to finish this series tonight. It doesn't mean that we've exhausted learning about the spiritual geography of Eretz Yisrael, but this is a good time to make a transition. So after Pesach, we'll start something new. Nisan and Pesach is all about newness. So we began the series. The first class is we looked in the Parsha of Ekev, in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy. And we saw that there were a number of descriptions of the land of Israel, the most beautiful in the whole Torah of the land of Israel. But there's one other place that is the entire book is infused with references to the land of Israel, and that's the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim, on the simple level, is a love story between a man and a woman, two lovers. According to the sages, especially Rabbi Akiva, who understood it as a divine allegory between the love of God and Israel. If you look at the Art Scroll book on Shir HaShirim, it explains that it doesn't translate it according to its literal man, woman. It takes place in the spring in the land of Israel. And there are scores of references to the land, its produce, its wine, its oil, its spices, its herbs, its grains, its mountains, its valleys. The entire story is taking place in Eretz Yisrael in the spring, and it's this love story. So love is in the air. But the Art Scroll translates it according to the allegorical understanding that it's a story between God and Israel. And it explains because sometimes the allegory is the simple understanding. So you have to understand that, because we learn according to Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod. The literal, the alluded to or hinted to, the allegorical, metaphorical, symbolic level, and then the mystical, spiritual level. So the Art Scroll was saying The allegory is the simple understanding. The love story between a man and a woman is not actually the literal understanding. It's only the stage. The literal understanding is the allegory. And so I want to read just a few of the verses, just so we can get an idea. Right in the second verse, Yishakeni minishikot pihu ki tovim dodecha miyayin. Kiss me with the kisses of your mouth, for they are even better than wine. Wine and vineyards and grapes are mentioned throughout the book of Shir HaShirim, over and over and over again. But here, the kisses of your mouth are the deep understandings of the Torah are greater than wine. Wine is Gematria 70, which is Sod, the secret understanding. So that's how it starts off. Already it's mentioning wine. The beginning of the second chapter, Ani chavatzelet hasharon shoshanat ha'amakim. I am like the rose of Sharon. Now, we mentioned many, many times along the Mediterranean, it's flat, it's plains from the north to the south. And in the middle of the country, to this day, it's called Sharon, from the Shir HaShirim. So here, I am the rose of Sharon, or the lilies of Sharon, that among the deep valleys. Then the next one, Ketapuach ba'atzei ya'ar ben dodi, Kain dodi ben habanim. Like a apple, like a fruitful, fragrant apple of the forest, so is my beloved. So the idea here is the land becomes the description of the love. So what we see here is there's a story of the love between a man and a woman, between God and Israel. But on the deepest level, this is the love between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. That's why all of the references, and when I mean scores of references, I mean scores. I'm just reading you just a few to get the idea. And here it says, Havi'eni, we're in the second chapter, fourth verse. Havi'eni el beta yayin. Bring me into the house of wine. But here it means bring me into the secrets of your Torah. Then in 2:8, Kol dodi hine zeba midaleg al harim mikabetz al givaot. The voice of my beloved. Here it's coming. It's leaping among the mountains. It's skipping on the hills. I hope everyone's getting a feel of this, how the description of the land, it's not just the background of the story. It becomes part of the love itself. The love that God has for the land. Because remember the verse, it says that God's eyes, it's a land that God seeks out. The eyes of God are on the land from the beginning of the year to the end. God loves the land. And therefore, we love the land. Again, I'm just picking out a few here. Here's a beautiful one, the 12th verse of the second chapter. Hanitzanim nireh ba'aretz, et hazamir higia, v'kol hator nishba ba'artzenu. So it says, For the winter has gone, the buds are bursting forth. The song of the songbird is in our land and can be heard in our land. So Kol HaTor, the Vilna Gaon, took those words for his treatment of the coming of Mashiach. The winter is past, the exile is past, and the song of the bird can be heard in the land. So he interpreted that, or the sages interpreted that that's the coming of Mashiach. So he called his book after that. There's a number of books, and I'm just looking at the time and I see that it's getting late. But there's a number of books that are named after verses in Shir HaShirim. One of them is Pardes HaRimonim, the pomegranate orchard, one of the most important books in Kabbalistic history, is the book written by Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who lived in Sfat at the same time as the Arizal. And his book is studied to this day. It's called Pardes Rimonim, from one of the verses here. There's another one called Ginat HaEgoz, the walnut orchard. This is a book from Rabbi Avram Abulafia called the Ginat HaEgoz. And I'm going to try to see if I can find it here quickly. That let's see. If you go to the 7th chapter, the 7th verse, this is very personal to me. It says, Ma yafit uma na'amt ahava b'tanugim. So it says, how beautiful, how pleasant is love of delights. It's from this verse that I named my book on the Parsha, Orchard of Delights, from this verse. So here you could see that throughout history, people were so inspired by the Song of Songs that they named books after it. They named things that they were inspired by. I could go on and on and on, but I'm suggesting that everyone, the next time you read the Song of Songs, again, read it as a love story between God and Israel, but also read it as a love story between God's love for the land and the Jewish people's love of the land. That is the real, the spiritual geography of Eretz Yisrael is most depicted in the Song of Songs than any other place. This is really the main place. And it ends again with mountains and hills. Barach dodi udmei lecha letzvi leofer ayelim al har habasamim. Escape, my beloved, and you are compared to a deer or a ram on the mountain of spices. That's how it ends. Remember, Har HaBayit is called Har HaMoriah, from myrrh, the spice, myrrh. Okay, now I want to end with two stories. One is not a story, really. It's just a Torah that in Parshat Lech Lecha, The verse says, Kum hitalech ba'aretz. God is talking to Avram. It says, Kum hitalech ba'aretz le'arka u'lerachva ki lecha et nena. God says to Avram, as soon as he comes to the land, he says, like, get up, walk through the land from its length to its width, because to you I am giving it. So Reb Shlomo once said this idea. It had an awesome effect on me personally. The simple Torah. He said, if you're ever in Eretz Yisrael and you're in some place and you feel an incredible connection to this place. Now, not like, okay, you're at Masada and this historical thing happened, or you're at the Kotel, not for historical reasons. That's awesome enough. You're in a place where this history happened and you feel, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I'm at the same place. But he was saying on a different level altogether. You're in Eretz Yisrael and you feel this personal connection to the land, not the history, to the land itself. He said, you know why you feel that? Because when Avram Avinu walked the length and breadth of the land, he thought of you there. When I heard this, I was like, oh my gosh. Even saying it, I'm almost crying. I'm almost crying just even saying these words, because I think everyone has had that experience. I've had it, but until I learned this from him, it was just this feeling, which is deep enough. But when he said that, because we all come from Avram and Sarah, and there's a part of Avram and Sarah in each one of us. And so when he walked the length and the width of the land, he was thinking of all of us, for real, because we all existed within him. When he walked the land, we were walking with him. And so when he thought of us, it's as if we were thinking of us in the future. Now, this is an awesome, awesome idea. And I wanted to leave everyone with this idea. And then one last story, which is one of my favorite stories ever. I've told it many times, but I'm going to tell it again now. And that's the story of the Vitebsker Rebbe. We spoke about him because he came with hundreds of Hasidim in the 1770s, which was unheard of. It was individuals or families would come to Israel, and it was incredibly difficult. He came with hundreds of people, and they settled in the 4 holy cities. So he first came to Pekian, then he went to Tzfat, and then he settled in Tiberia, and that's where he's buried. And the following story is he told this story. And the story is that one time he said to his Hasidim, we have to make a celebration tonight. Great. Everyone came, eating, drinking, singing, dancing. And at one point someone says, Rebbe, what are we celebrating? What's the occasion? So he says like this. Here's the story. He said, when I was a young boy, shluchim, people from Israel used to go around to the different communities in Europe collecting money, because it was virtually impossible to live here. It was very, very difficult to live in Israel. They could only survive on contributions. And since the Jewish people, it was very important that there were Jews in Israel, were happy to contribute. So they would come and they would go from place to place. So when they would come to my village, I was always just fascinated. And they would tell stories of the holy cities, the land. And every time I would want to learn more. One time, one of them came, he gave his whole speech, people gave money, everyone left. And I came to him and said, please tell me more, tell me more. And the man said, young boy, I can see that you have a soul that's connected to Eretz Israel. So I'm going to tell you a secret. When you come to the land of Israel, when you can hear the mountains singing, you can hear the song of the trees, you can hear the melody of the fields, then you'll know about the holiness of the land of Israel. So he's telling his Hasidim, he said, we've been here for over 10 years now. Every day I go out to the fields and I'm waiting to hear the song. I never forgot what this man told me. He said, I can tell you this morning, I went out and I heard the trees singing. I heard the fields, their melody, the grasses of the field. I heard the mountains exulting. Now, anyone just has to go to the Psalms, and David HaMelech composed many Psalms having heard the song of Eretz Yisrael. He said, but this was the first time that I heard it, and that's why I'm making a celebration, because now I know that I'm in the Holy Land. So I wanted to end with that story. I want to bless everyone, as my wife so kindly let everyone know that it's my birthday now. So I have the power of blessing. So I want to bless everyone who's watching, who has been with us through all of these classes, for all of the people who don't come on live but who watch it later. I want to give everyone a blessing that we can continue to be a learning community. I can't even express how much strength it gives me, how much inspiration it gives me, having all of us learning together. And I hope it will continue for many, many, many years. Pesach is coming, and we are in tremendous need of miracles and wonders right now. We have seen these last 2.5 years, we should not minimize it. We have seen incredible miracles, but we need more. So I invite everyone to pray along with me that in the next few days, the next few weeks, that we can see really not just an end to this war. We need more than that. We need redemption. We need salvation. We need peace in the whole world. And so that is my blessing to everyone, that we feel peace in our hearts, in our souls, in our communities, and in the entire world. Trying to, no, okay. Why won't it let me? Can't stop this.